On July 16th, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, on a mission for a moon landing. Aboard the Apollo 11 were three men: Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin. How did these guys get chosen to be part of that first crew to land on the moon? One guy played a very big role in this, Jim McDivitt. And following this is an explanation for how fate and the decision of Jim McDivitt put those guys on the first manned lunar landing. And being that this is my first recording, if you like it, my first update, please hit like and click the subscribe button. And that certainly will help me to find out whether or not I'm doing stuff interesting. I'm not just going to be doing stuff having to do with space, but it's going to cover all sorts of different topics. As it is, let's cut to the chase. Deke Slayton was one of the original 7 astronauts. However, he was not allowed to fly due to the detection of a heart condition and became the head of the astronaut office. In making his assignments, Deke Slayton came up with a system that the prime crew would have a backup crew, and the backup crew would become the prime crew on the third mission following the mission to which that backup crew was assigned. Therefore, Apollo 8's backup crew would be taking the prime crew as the crew for Apollo 11. Apollo 9 would take the prime crew for Apollo 12, and so forth. This means that the Apollo 11 crew was the backup for Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was originally assigned to 3 crew members: Command Module Pilot Dave Scott, Lunar Module Pilot Rusty Schweikert, and Commander Jim McDivitt. Apollo 8 was to be the initial test flight of the lunar module. McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikert kept themselves very busy learning all the lunar module systems along with the command module systems in order for them to perform an ideal test flight of the LEM, which was the first pure spacecraft ever to be thought of to be manned by humans. Backing up the crew would be the commander, Gaptooth Pete Conrad, his fellow Navy and prior crew member, Dick Gordon, and rookie and all-around good guy, Al Bean. These were to be the crew of Apollo 11. But there was a big problem. While the command module was coming along nicely and the Saturn V had already been tested, and Wernher von Braun thought that all of the problems that came along with it, such as the pogo oscillation, which you can go ahead and look up, would be fixed, the lunar module was an absolute mess. When it was delivered in July of 1968, there were over 100 mission-critical errors that prevented it from being ready. There was no way this thing was going to be ready to go in 1968, and probably wouldn't be ready to go until February or March of 1969. Enter George Low, who was the manager of the Apollo Space Program Office. George Low looked at it and decided that rather than having a big gap, let's do something bold. Send the command module in lunar orbit and back without the lunar module in order to test out the navigation and other techniques. On September 12th of 1962, John F. Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon before this decade is out." And George Low was going to make sure that happened, even if it meant it took some balls. So Deke Slayton approached Jim McDivitt with that mission and said, "Hey, Jim, how about we're going to switch the mission? We'd like you to go to the moon instead." This suggestion by Deke, after going through Jim Low and everybody through the NASA administration up to Jim Webb, came in August of 1968. Prior to that, in July of 1968, Michael Collins was grounded and thus was stripped from the Apollo 9 crew. Michael Collins was grounded because he had a disc herniation in his neck that required some surgery. He was therefore replaced with his backup, a fellow by the name of Jim Lovell. When offered the opportunity to fly to the moon with only the command and service module, Jim McDivitt said, "No way." Look, Jim McDivitt was a test pilot, as was Dave Scott and Rusty Schweikert, but McDivitt saw the first flight of the lunar module to be a test pilot's dream, and there was no way that he was going to give up the opportunity to wring that lunar excursion module out in space and find out what it could do. So the next thing Deke Slayton did was approach Apollo 9 commander Frank Borman to say, "Hey, we're going to change your mission. How'd you like to be the first person to go to the moon?" The backup crew of Apollo 9 therefore became the backup crew of Apollo 8. Under Deke Slayton's usual rotation, this backup crew for Apollo 8 became the prime crew for Apollo 11. It consisted of Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, who had switched with Jim Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin. It has long been wondered how it was that Neil Armstrong was selected to be the commander of that Apollo 11 moon landing. And what we know at this point is it looks like it had a great deal to do with fate. What was amazing was that Jim Lovell went on to back up the Apollo 11 crew as the backup commander, which meant that he would take Apollo 14. However, due to the training requirements for the Apollo 13 original commander, Alan Shepard, Jim Lovell was switched to the command of Apollo 13 along with his crew. And we know how that goes. So there's a little dose of history right there, and we're cutting through and cutting to the chase.